Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My name is Tom Fardon. I'm one of the chairs of Grand Rounds, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the final Grand Rounds of 2021. This is the closest that you get to Christmas for a Grand Round. We're not going to do one next week. I think we'd planned not to do it anyway, but I think with the upcoming onslaught of Omicron, it might be we all might be a little bit busy to sit down for an hour to have a Grand Round next week. So I'm delighted to welcome Robert Dawes, consultant dermatologist in the Scottish Photobiology Service here in Nine Wells, and Vicky Maguire, who's a principal clinical scientist. I can't quite remember why Vicky contacted me a little while ago, but whilst we were communicating, I said, you know, it'd be fascinating to get a Grand Rounds about porphyria, and so they jumped at the opportunity to come and speak about the service. So one of those sort of Cinderella diagnoses, I suppose. We all know what porphyria is, or at least we'd like to think we do, and we'd like to think that we'll be able to spot it. But can we? And do we really know what we're talking about? So let's hear from the experts. So I think Robert's going to speak first. I think Vicky's going to speak after that, and there is some interaction in here. So they'll explain about the Mentimeter quiz later on. So Robert, thank you very much for joining us. Looking forward to hearing your talk.
So, well, I'll first give a wee bit of an introduction. This is this bit, and then Vicky will talk about this Scottish Cutaneous Porphyria service, which is part of the Photobiology service in Scotland. I'll then talk a bit about some of the porphyrias, both affecting the skin and not affecting the skin, and there'll be a bit of the Mentimeter interaction if for those who want to take part in it and have got the smartphones that are needed for that, then as well as later when I do the quiz. But before the quiz, Vicky will talk about what sort of samples are needed for different porphyrias are suspected. But before Vicky's introduction to the service, this is really just to get you used to using the Mentimeter if you want to. So what you do is on a smartphone, I'm trying to do it at the moment, you go to menti.com and you put in and then it will allow you to put in the code number 5529075. And then once you've done it once, it sort of stays in the system. Somebody's managed it quicker than I have. I've not even got into menti.com. It's not opening at all. So I'll just give a little bit of time for people to put things that they're thinking of there, so that we can sort of know what you're interested in when we're talking. So sort of pain of various sorts, light sensitivity for some of the porphyrias, and yes, there's still controversy as to whether King George had a type of porphyria, probably acute intermittent porphyria if he had it. Vampires. If I was able to add to it, I'd probably also put Cochrane, like of the Cochrane reviews, because he had very good porphyria, Dr. Cochrane.
We're just going to swap over here. So I'm just going to give a bit of introduction to the Scottish Photobiology Service, which was a national service which was established in 1972 here in Nine Wells in the Photobiology unit, which was set up to meet the clinical needs of all patients in Scotland who have photosensitivity diseases. In 2006, the Cutaneous porphyria service was officially added, although we had already had a lab service here in place since the 70s, where we were diagnosing patients in-house who were having phototesting here. The service here is funded by National Services Scotland, and it's key for us really that the photobiology unit is really an integral part of dermatology. So the aim of the service is to provide a comprehensive diagnostic, therapeutic and management service for all Scottish patients who experience photosensitivity. And we do this mainly through complex light-based skin testing investigations, but we also provide a management and advisory service for patients who have a wide range of photosensitivity diseases. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we also have a clinical and lab service to investigate patients with suspected skin porphyria conditions. And this would be to rule in or rule out porphyria as part of the diagnostic service. So the photosensitivity diseases that we see in the photobiology unit here are really heterogeneous in their presentation, their etiology and their prevalence. They can affect people of any age, any gender or any skin phototype. And they range from really common conditions such as polymorphic light eruption, which can affect up to 1 in 5 people in the Northern European population, through to rare and life-limiting disorders such as xeroderma pigmentosum. So the Scottish Cutaneous Porphyria service is part of the photobiology service. We have a laboratory service here which has been accredited as a medical laboratory since 2019 to ISO 15189. Unfortunately, we previously weren't eligible for accreditation under the prior systems under CPA, but we were very pleased that we were able to gain accreditation a couple of years ago. So the lab provides a specialist diagnostic service which is capable of biochemical diagnosis of all types of cutaneous porphyrias, and we accept referrals from all across Scotland. So the biochemical analysis that we perform is really with the aim of identifying whether the patient's clinical symptoms are due to a porphyria, and if the answer to that question is yes, what type of porphyria does the patient have? And we also undertake biochemical monitoring of disease activity and, where applicable, monitoring treatment responses. The SCPS has also recently applied to become an BPNET Specialist Centre of Excellence. So this is something that's been established by the European Porphyria Network as a way of recognising centres with clinical excellence and expertise in diagnosis and management of patients with porphyrias. And this requires evidence of working closely with other specialist services, and we were very pleased to be able to recognise the interactions that we have with other specialties throughout the hospital. So we're quite a small team with combined experience in porphyrias of almost 100 years, I calculated this morning. We have a specialist laboratory team, which is made up of Nikki, Lisa, Pfizer and Jana. Jill is a fantastic admin support, and then myself and Dr. Daw are the main members of the team. We're a very small service, and I'm sure many of you will recognise some of the team members who've been here for a very long time. And I will hand back over to Dr. Daw.
I'll talk a bit about the porphyrias in general, but I'm showing this slide first because I'm wanting to remind everyone who needs reminding that in the porphyrias that affect the skin, the effects in the skin are caused by porphyrins in the skin absorbing visible light, particularly violet and blue light. So it's a visible light, daylight problem, not an ultraviolet problem. Now I'll speak mainly about 3 of the porphyrias on this slide, and then go on to some other slides where I'm just talking in general about it. But I'll spend a bit longer on this slide because of the biochemical pathways we all had to imprint in our mind for exams at medical school, this is the only one that I've ever really found helpful. And so all the different porphyrias are due to problems in this chemical pathway producing heme, which obviously forms part of the cytochrome P450 system, part of heme and hemoglobin, and so on. And in this sort of simplified version of pathway, you think of glycine, the amino acids, and succinyl-CoA from citric acid cycle, forming aminolivulinic acid, forming porphyrin, forming hydroxymethylbiline. These substances are all porphyrin precursors. They're not actually porphyrins, and they don't absorb visible light. So if you get a build-up in them, you don't get skin problems because they don't absorb visible light in the skin, so you don't get the skin problems. Whereas these substances are all actual porphyrins which absorb visible light. And in any of the porphyrias where you get a build-up of these substances, you can get skin features because these substances absorb visible light in the skin. Almost all the porphyrias, all apart from one, are due to reduced activity of an enzyme somewhere or another along this pathway. And nearly always, it's a genetic condition. The big exception is the commonest porphyria, acquired porphyria cutaneous tarda, which is due to liver disease plus iron overload in the liver, which in turn reduces the activity of uroporphyrin decarboxylase. There's one rare porphyria where it's a gain of function mutation, but nearly always it's reduced activity of an enzyme. But I'll mention acute intermittent porphyria, erythropoietic protoporphyria, and porphyria cutaneous tarda mainly, as they're if you know a bit about them, you know about most of the porphyrias. So acute intermittent porphyria is the commonest acute attack porphyria. In Scotland, it's probably about 1 in 70,000 of the population, maybe about 1 in 20,000 near Paisley, for example. As like with a lot of autosomal dominant conditions, there are pockets of the country where there will be big families with it, and it's more common. And in most of the porphyrias, the main problems are caused by upstream effects rather than downstream effects. So in acute intermittent porphyria, you have reduced activity of porphyrin deaminase or hydroxymethylbilane synthase, whether the two terms being the same. Usually the reduced activity isn't enough to cause a problem, but if somebody with acute intermittent porphyria is given one of the many drugs that they shouldn't be given, they need more cytochrome P450 to metabolize the drug. Therefore, they need more heme to make more cytochrome P450 to make more. So their ALA synthase activity increases. They produce more ALA. They produce more porphyrin, and they don't have enough activity of the porphyrin deaminase to convert all that into the next substances. So you get a buildup of these in the body. And aminolivulinic acid is directly neurotoxic, and so probably a lot of the effects in an acute porphyria are caused by that. Diagnostically, as Vicky will come on to, porphyrin help is useful. But the clinical symptoms are mainly aminolivulinic acid and its effects on nerve function. So it affects autonomic nerves, it affects autonomic nerves affecting the gut. You can get severe abdominal pain. If you check, you'll often find there's tachycardia and a postural blood pressure drop because of autonomic nerve damage as well. Sometimes other nerves are affected. You can get a mononeuritis multiplex, you can get a Guillain-Barré-like syndrome, you can get a psychosis, all due to nerve damage due to an increased level of aminolivulinic acid. And in that porphyria, acute intermittent porphyria, you don't, or you don't, with very rare exceptions, there are always exceptions in medicine, get skin manifestations because these precursors are building up, but they don't react with light. Porphyria cutaneous tarda, there are a couple of rare types which are purely inherited, but usually it's due to chronic liver inflammation plus iron overload in the liver. So, and it's usually not one single cause. So it might be being heterozygous for one of the common hemochromatosis mutations, maybe drinking too much alcohol, maybe something else like hepatitis C, although we're seeing that less as the cause now. And so one of the important things about porphyria cutaneous tarda is that although it can be a problem in itself, it's also a marker that there definitely is chronic liver disease going on that you want to then identify and treat if possible. And the skin porphyrias, the features in the skin mainly depend on where the porphyrins build up. And so if you've got a problem here and you've got a build-up of uroporphyrins, which as the name suggests are urine soluble, these porphyrins move out from the blood vessels, tend to concentrate at dermo-epidermal junction, and there interact with visible light to cause weakness at the dermo-epidermal junction, so the epidermis can lift off the underlying dermis to cause a blister, or shear off the underlying dermis as a feature of a manifestation of fragility. Whereas in the second most common skin porphyria, erythropoietic protoporphyria, you get completely different skin manifestations because you've got a reduced activity of the photodiagnostic enzyme that puts the iron in protoporphyrin, and protoporphyrins are very lipid soluble and hardly water soluble at all. And so they tend to stay around the blood vessels and the nerves that run along the blood vessels. And so typically you get pain rather than signs in erythropoietic protoporphyria, but I'll come on to some pictures of that. And then just to mention that there are others like the hereditary copper porphyria and variant porphyria, which you can sort of think of as almost like a mixture of skin features of porphyria cutaneous tarda and acute attack features of acute intermittent porphyria. And so thinking it from a dermatological point of view, there's different classifications of porphyrias, but I tend to think of the phototoxic skin porphyrias, mainly the protoporphyrias, of which the commonest is erythropoietic protoporphyria, the blistering and fragility skin porphyrias, the acute attack porphyrias, whether like acute intermittent porphyria, they don't have skin involvement, or like hereditary copper porphyria, they also involve skin sometimes. And then there's a rare group of the severe congenital porphyrias like erythropoietic porphyria, Gunter's disease, or homozygous varigate porphyria. And so of the skin porphyrias, so fragility and bullae and the acute phototoxic ones, I show this picture because often this sort of prickling, burning discomfort that once it starts typically lasts a few days can be relieved a little bit in the short term by applying something like a towel with cold water on it. This was one of the 3 patients I know of in the world, one who is in Tayside with homozygous varigate porphyria. And all these porphyrias are rare, although some not so rare. Porphyria cutaneous tarda isn't extremely rare. In Scotland, varigate porphyria is rare, but in parts of the Western Cape in South Africa, it's quite common. And so here's another of the questions that which enzyme has reduced activity in porphyria cutaneous tarda? See if I can see how many people are here to see how many people I should allow to answer. So the cause of porphyria cutaneous tarda is reduced activity of uroporphyrin and decarboxylase. And I suppose the way of remembering that is that it's the typical fragility and blistering porphyria, and it's related to water-soluble uroporphyrins building up. And so it's the reduced activity of uroporphyrin and decarboxylase, usually an acquired reduced activity, although rarely there are genetic conditions that can cause it. There's a type 2 and type 3 genetic porphyria cutaneous tarda, and an even rarer homozygous genetic porphyria cutaneous tarda, the hepatoerythropoietic porphyria. So another way of sort of classifying porphyrins is thinking about where the main problem is. Is it in the bone marrow or is it in the liver? And so is porphyria cutaneous hepatic or bone marrow related? Yeah, so it's mainly hepatic, and I mean it's usually the acquired type, which is caused by a liver problem. Other porphyrias like acute intermittent porphyria are also hepatic because the main problem is in the liver, but it's not caused by liver disease. That one. Here's the back of somebody's hands with porphyria cutaneous charge. You can see the unilocular single blister here. Possibly some tiny little milia inclusion cysts, and marks that really just reflect the fragility and probably previous blisters. But you can see that it's mostly over the dorsal thenar eminence. And if you think about how you hold your hand when you're walking, it's these areas that get the most visible light. Whereas unless you're a taxi driver, for example, you don't have so much involvement of the distal fingers, exposure of the distal fingers to daylight. So the next slide is a question asking what these little white things are. See if I can go back. These are milia, but the idea that the might be calcium deposits, I think, is perfectly reasonable. They could be. You'd like to feel them, and if they're milia, they're sort of firm. If they're calcium, they're hard. Milia are epidermal inclusion cysts caused by almost anything that can disrupt their dermal-epidermal junction. But if you see milia in a photodistribution, is often a pointer towards one of the bullous and fragility porphyrias, of which the commonest is Porphyria cutaneous. Here a blister and a question about the type of blister it is. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a unilocular blister. It's a single, fairly large blister. It's not made up of tiny little vesicles joining together as in the blister of a dermatitis, where you've got scattering of involvement higher up in the epidermis. This is a dermal junction problem. And usually with porphyria cutaneous you do get blistering and fragility, often in the backs of the hand, sometimes on the face as well. A lot of men will report that they seem to cut themselves more when they're shaving. But you can also get other features usually accompanying these, but sometimes as the only feature initially, like increased pigmentation, increased hair growth, not hirsutism, not in a male pattern distribution, just generally increased hair growth, especially on photo-exposed sites. And you get other things like solar urticaria and fibrosis within the dermis. Here's just a picture of solar urticaria, somebody with porphyria cutaneous, but mainly just to emphasize that it's visible light. This is 430 nanometer blue light. And if you're in a setting where you don't have a lot of equipment, a simple Woods lamp can be quite helpful. A Woods lamp emits sort of 410 nanometer roughly violet light, and if you shine violet light on the urine and the urine re-emits with a purplish color, then that's telling you that there's something in the urine that's absorbing the light and re-emitting it, and that something will need to always be porphyrins. Won't tell you which porphyrins, but in the right setting, it's if you think it's most likely to be porphyria cutaneous and you do this, then it is even more likely it's porphyria cutaneous. And in many parts of the world, you can't do more elaborate tests. This is one of the more elaborate tests we do. This is a spectropluorimeter and opened up to show violet light shining on the patient's plasma, and the violet light is absorbed by chemicals which are porphyrins in the plasma and re-emitted as a red-orange color. And the human eye just sees that as a red-orange color, but the machine can tell you exactly which peak in nanometers that red color is, which gives you a good clue often as to which porphyria it might be. Some porphyrias have the same peak because it's the same mixture of porphyrins. So, and in particular, Porphyria tarda and Erythropoietic porphyria have the same peak. So you definitely want to distinguish them, even though Erythropoietic porphyria is much rarer. You can get acute attacks with that, so you need to avoid certain drugs and so on. We'll go on to say a wee bit more about erythropoietic protoporphyria. But first of all, just which enzyme has reduced activity? Yes, most have said ferrokinase, which is the right answer. It's the enzyme that puts the iron, the ferrous moiety, into the protoporphyrin. It definitely isn't protoporphyrin oxidase, but I can understand why you might think it's that. So it's a reduced activity of ferrokinase, usually inherited. There are different ways of inheritance, but it's usually you acquire from one parent a sort of more major mutation in the gene encoding ferrokinase, and from the other parent you have a commoner polymorphism or whatever, or hypomorphism, the different terms used nowadays, that is very common in most populations anyway. And usually you need the two. Having the major mutation on its own is usually not enough to cause erythropoietic protoporphyria. And in this condition, a lot of the manifestations of the skin features caused by the buildup of protoporphyrin, which causes a severe prickly, burny sensation after exposure to visible light. Because protoporphyrin concentrates around the endothelium, sometimes, in fact, not at all uncommonly, you get puffiness, but in the backs of the hands because fluid leaks out. And if there's a severe enough attack, even red cells can leak out and you can get purpura. Through mechanisms that haven't been fully worked out, almost everyone with erythropoietic protoporphyria is slightly anemic. But if you give iron, you'll just make things worse because iron induces ALA synthase right at the beginning of the pathway, and the ferrokinase it's not active enough to use iron and the increased protoporphyrin that the iron induces. Other features you can get in erythropoietic protoporphyria are that rarely you can get severe liver disease from it, and protoporphyria liver disease does kill a few people. I only know of one person within the last 20 years in Scotland who died of protoporphyria liver failure. But it's a sort of vicious circle if it starts. So if you have liver impairment, you're not able to get rid of the protoporphyrin properly, so more protoporphyrin just crystallizes out in the bile ducts, and the liver impairment becomes worse, and it just goes on and on. But again, emphasizing that it's usually symptoms, not signs, and it is often people who describe applying cold water either from a tap or a towel or something cold from a freezer to try and give some relief over the 3 to 5 days that it typically takes after it starts before it goes away. But it's an extremely unpleasant pain, and it can be very unpredictable. Somebody might know that usually they can go out for 2 minutes and put out the washing in the morning as long as it's not too bright, but on one day they might be caught out, and it seems to be a similar day, but they do get the pain, and then once the pain starts, it goes on and on. And that's probably partly why almost everyone with erythropoietic protoporphyria is vitamin D deficient, because they're scared of any exposure. Sometimes you get subtle features like a slight redness, so is all you're really seeing here. Sometimes you get more skin features, and people have had it for a wee while. You often get these what look a bit like chickenpox scars, but just a bit more elongated than typical chickenpox scars. And in porphyrias like protoporphyria, particularly where you can't treat the underlying causes, you can often do with porphyria cutaneous harder. You often are thinking about photoprotection as a main way of dealing with the problem. So I think photoprotection of all sorts in the same sort of way. There are environmental things you can do, there are behavioral things you can do, there are clothing things you can do, and there are also sunscreen things you can do, but not one of them, those sort of approaches will work on its own usually. And again, emphasizing that in the porphyrias, it's visible light, not the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. And I think quite a lot of people who are sort of newly diagnosed with porphyria, it sort of helps them to understand what's going on when they realize it's visible daylight, not ultraviolet. Why it doesn't have to be days that you might get a sunburn because there's enough shorter ultraviolet B in particular. And in terms of sunscreen photoprotection, there aren't commercial sunscreens available that are good for visible light. So in the UK, the main ones that are used are still the so-called Dundee creams, reflectant sunscreens intended to block visible light, but they are messy, which is why they're coloured to try and make them a bit easier to use. People sort of blend them together to try and match their skin colour. And a mention of acute and porphyry, I've already said a bit about it. The main importance of it is that it's in the differential of so many things: acute abdomen, mononeuritis, meltitis, psychosis, Guillain-Barré syndrome. The only one I remember diagnosing from the start was when it was an SSO, I suppose the equivalent of foundation year 2 now, and we had a referral from the surgeons who'd already removed somebody's appendix, and then they removed mesenteric lymph nodes, and the patient was still getting episodes of pain. And it was in a fairly small peripheral hospital that I was in then, so I was able to go down to the lab at night and do a test for porphyrin in the urine. Maybe not the sort of test that we would want to do now. So another question: does acute intermittent porphyria usually affect the skin? Yeah. So the answer is no. I mean, I put in the usually because there are always exceptions to medicine, and you can get a non-enzymatic condensation conversion of porphyrin precursors to porphyrins that react with light, and so you can rarely get subtle skin features, but typically you don't. Again, I think I'll let Vicky speak about testing then.
So when we think about diagnosing porphyrias, I'm sure many of you have a favourite medical drama, whether you're a Grey's Anatomy fan or a Resident fan or CSI fan. I found this clip, which I thought was quite entertaining, that you might enjoy for a few moments.
That's it. That's in the sun. If urine exposed to UV light turns purple, it's a sign of a rare genetic disorder called acute intermittent porphyria. Symptoms include bloating, high blood pressure, seizures, constipation, and overdose. Figured it out.
So diagnosing porphyria can be quite a challenge, but we do rely on referrals from specialties across the hospital, and we'd encourage anybody who has any suspicion of porphyria to consider referring to us. So how do we request porphyria testing here in 9 Miles? Well, we have a request form which is available on our website. The website address is listed here, or you can email us directly. We have a generic mailbox set up for contact for the service. Unfortunately, cutaneous porphyria testing isn't currently available through ICE, but we can't accept any specimens without one of our request forms. So I would just encourage people to check that out. And if you are going to refer to us, I would please encourage everybody to include as much clinical information as possible. So what symptoms the patient is experiencing, and particularly if they're taking any medications or if those might be photoactive. All too often we receive referrals that just say porphyria, and it makes it extremely difficult when you're trying to diagnose in the lab and to try and work out a diagnostic strategy. So as much clinical information as possible would be strongly encouraged, please. And the other thing which is really critical when sending samples for porphyrin testing is to protect them from light. So as in the video clip, the doctors had left the sample out in sunlight and it had changed colour. This is a result of the degradation within the sample. So samples for porphyrin testing really do need to be wrapped ideally in foil as soon as possible after collection. But please also ensure that the container is labelled underneath. Again, one of the things that we often find is that we receive samples referred to us which have been nicely light protected, but there are no patient details on the tube. So once you have your request form, you have your nicely light protected labelled sample, please send it to the lab. By all means, pop along and see us, but the portering service delivered to us at least twice a day. And then which specimens do you want to send? So if you're considering a possible bullous porphyria, as Dr. Dawes already mentioned, whether that's Porphyria cutaneous or variegate porphyria or hereditary porphyria, if you're having skin features, it's important that you send us a random urine sample in addition to a plasma or a fecal sample if it's an adult patient. And if it's a child, all 3 specimens would be required, please. If it's a possible protoporphyria, such as erythropoietic protoporphyria or the rarer X-linked protoporphyria, a blood sample so we can extract plasma and red cells would be the first line of testing for these. If we got a positive result in the urine or plasma sample in a bullous porphyria, we will often follow up with a fecal sample to confirm the diagnosis, because as Dr. Dawes mentioned, it's really important for us to be able to distinguish between those bullous porphyrias that just cause cutaneous symptoms and those which can also cause acute attacks. So what if you're curious about an acute attack porphyria? So if you're suspicious of one of these, which could be AIP, VP or HCP, a random urine sample for porphyrin precursor analysis. So as Dr. Dawes mentioned, there are 2 types of porphyrin precursors which are stable enough to be detected, so porphobilinogen or PBG and aminolevulinic acid. In most patients who have an ongoing attack of acute porphyria, the PBG will be more than 10 times the upper limit of normal within a week of the symptoms starting. When patients are no longer symptomatic or the symptoms are subsiding, the PBG levels can drop off very quickly, especially in VP and HCP. So in these conditions, it would be really critical to send a plasma and a fecal sample as well, so that these additional assays can be done to rule out HCP and VP. So PBG and ALA testing is not currently available here within Tayside. It used to be, PBG testing used to be available through the biochemistry lab. But unfortunately, the kit that was used to test for PBG was removed from the market. So now there are very few labs in the UK that are doing these tests. You can request PBG testing on ICE, but as I say, this requires a sample to be sent away to another lab, which is not really ideal for a current diagnosis of a possible acute porphyria attack. So one of the things that we're working with at the moment is to try and be able to offer both precursors as a testing service within 9 Wales. And we're seeking support for this from National Services Scotland. But unfortunately, there's no definitive answer as to whether this will be possible. As always, it comes down to the requirement for investment and resource in services. But watch this space. In the photobiology service, we're also closely linked with national and European Porphyria networks. So the British Porphyria Association is a national charity that supports people with porphyria. They have a very informative website which has got a lot of information on the different porphyrias and the help that's available. Here in the department, we've been closely linked with supporting their educational activities and fundraising. The National Acute Porphyria Service, or NAPS, is a national service set up in England and Wales, which we in Scotland now have agreement to work with. They provide clinical advice, and where it's appropriate for patients who are having acute attacks, they can also organise hemarginate treatment. There's an emergency number. Their hotline is based at the University Hospital of Wales, so they would be the first port of call for any new patient who's having an acute porphyria attack, or if you see patients with having recurrent attacks. There's also a great network, the British and Irish Porphyria Network, which is based across the UK and Ireland, supporting clinicians and scientists in sharing knowledge and information on porphyrias. And we're also linked with the European Porphyria Network, BPNET, which I mentioned earlier in terms of the Porphyria Centres of Excellence. BPNET also have an excellent website with a great deal of information about porphyrias if you're interested. And they're also running a series of webinars in the spring, which will be of interest of anybody who's curious to know more about porphyrias. So we are now back to quiz time.
Just got three questions here. The first one is maybe the harder one, unless you like reading Isabel Allendi's books, and I've read her book called Paul after her daughter. But thinking of porphyry is most likely to cause people to die at a fairly young age. And so, yes, it could be any of these acute attack porphyrias. It could be erythropoietic protoporphyria. People do sometimes die of the liver failure that can result from that. I don't think porphyria cutaneous tarda itself would ever be expected to cause death. When I read the book, I thought it was probably acute intermittent porphyria. Isabel Allendi didn't say in the book what diagnosis, but reading it, I think it was acute intermittent porphyria. So this question, a 42-year-old reports blisters and fragility on exposed sites, where he's been admitted with severe abdominal pain. And he says that an aunt has a porphyry of some sort. He doesn't know what type. So what test is most important initially? So several of these tests could be appropriate in trying to diagnose it, but what tests would possibly alter management initially? I would have said porphyrin in the urine, because you want to know if it is an acute attack porphyria, is there likely to be a current acute attack, and that's going to alter the immediate management. I didn't sort of explain it in any detail, but you can use things like an analog of hemarginate during an acute attack. You can also use things like carbohydrate loading, giving 10% dextrose, for example. You would want to go on to other things like porphyrin plasma scan, the urine porphyrins, and maybe the fecal porphyrins, in trying to diagnose it if you think it is a porphyria, but that wouldn't also lead to treatment. Then final question: a 32-year-old Swedish woman, that's the clue, reports episodes of severe abdominal pain. They're especially before her period. What porphyry is most likely? Yeah, I would have said acute intermittent porphyria, but any acute attack porphyria, so including porphyria, could have these features. When I was saying her being Swedish was a clue, is the country terms for the different porphyrias aren't used often nowadays, but acute intermittent porphyria is still sometimes called Swedish porphyria. In the south of Sweden, it's probably no more common than Scotland, but in the north of Sweden, the Lapland area is much more common. Whereas variant porphyria is still sometimes called South African porphyria because it's more common there. And Vicky just mentioned the British and Irish Porphyria Network and the British Porphyria Association. Vicky and I are co-chairs of BIPNET at the moment, so we'll be hosting a meeting in Dundee, partly in person and partly hybrid for any of those who are interested. So we'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Robert, and to Vicky as well. I feel like I've been put through the ringer there with all your questions, and there's a reason you're an expert in that, and I really am not. So it's really very interesting, fantastic talk. Thanks very much. Does anyone in the audience have any questions they'd like to put in the chat, or are you brave enough to turn your microphone on and ask the question in person? As Vicky says, I think we've all seen on our favorite American medical melodrama, somebody pull the diagnosis of porphyria out of their tail end. And we all hope that one day we might make the similar diagnosis. But the truth is, I think the people we do see with porphyria are people who, somebody cleverer than me has already made the diagnosis, and they come in with that diagnosis, and we worry what are we meant to do, particularly in acute medicine or acute surgery when it's out of hours, and we don't want to make mistakes, we don't want to mess things up. So in terms of the ongoing management of acute AIP particularly, and the acute porphyrias, what's our best resource for getting advice about how to get the right treatment for these people?
So now I think the National Acute Porphyria Service can give useful advice. Until recently, I think he's just retired now. It was Mike Badminton in Cardiff who usually gave that advice, but there are a few people in that. So there's Peter Galloway, although he's just about to retire in Glasgow, and Alison Cousins in Edinburgh. Although I'm a dermatologist, I am still happy to advise on acute intermittent porphyria, even if it's not got skin features. But the first source of advice now would be the National Acute Porphyria Service. In terms of sort of common questions, it's often important to think which drugs safe if you're needing to give a drug to somebody who's possibly got acute intermittent porphyria. So maybe somebody who's not been admitted because of it, was admitted for something else and you need to give a drug. I think the best website for finding drug information is now the Norwegian Porphyria Association. If you just put NAPOS, NAPOS in any of the search engines, you'll get into that. And it's good because it doesn't just say porphyrinogenic or not. It gives you an idea as to how likely it is, and gives you some ideas to what you can use as well as what you can't use.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's really helpful. These diseases are rare, but they do crop up. I mean, numerous times in my career have people come in with a diagnosis of porphyria, usually with something else, as you describe, and they're often in pain. And there's a what analgesia do we give, or they need an acute treatment, and is it safe to do that? Often the patients are more clued up than I am, but that's really helpful advice. Does anybody else in the audience have any questions or just comments that they'd like to make? I was intrigued by the milia on the hands. Do you do anything about that?
They usually eventually just come out themselves over time once you've treated the condition. If they're troublesome enough, you can sort of just nick them with a wee odd and treat or squeeze them out. Grand.
Okay. Well, thanks very much again. That brings the 2021 Grand Round programme to a conclusion. And we've had a really fantastic series of talks, which we've managed to keep going through the pandemic's ups and downs. The majority of those talks are available on our YouTube channel if you want to go and have just search for Dundee Grand Rounds and we pop up. Please subscribe and all the rest of it. There are a number of talks from this semester which I have to admit I've not had much time to edit and upload, but perhaps that's my task for Christmas. So have a good Christmas, everyone, when it comes, and hopefully the clinical workload over this next few weeks with Omicron will not be quite as tsunami-like as Nicola Sturgeon has suggested. Stay safe. Have a good Christmas. See you again in the new year.